So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. I'm Jacob Reynolds, and this week delighted to be joined on the podcast by our Executive Director, Frank Furedi. Welcome, Frank.
Pleasure.
And also delighted to be joined by our colleague, Paul Rougeron. Paul, welcome.
I'm glad to be here.
This week on the podcast, we're going to be talking about the shocking decision to ban Rassemblement National leader Marine Le Pen from running in France's presidential election. We're going to be talking about what Trump calls Liberation Day, or a big package of tariffs headed for Europe. And we're also going to take a look at the European Commission's rather unorthodox use of ChatGPT to try and fob off people asking for information. So coming first to this incredible decision that really shook all of Europe and seemed to also have caught even Marine Le Pen by surprise, the announcement that following a trial for misusing European parliamentary funds, that Marine Le Pen was not just found guilty, but also banned from running in the next presidential election. And most kind of uniquely and controversially about this case, the sentence was applied immediately following the ruling, compared to how it would usually happen, which is you exhaust your appeals and then the sentence might be kind of implemented after that. But Frank, this is, at one level, it fits a pattern of repeated use of law in the courts to stifle opposition figures. But just to the face of it, the scale of the fact that this major leader, one of Europe's most kind of recognizable anti-establishment patriotic figures, has literally been banned from taking part in the political process. What did you make of it?
Well, I think it, as you suggest, it's part of the pattern of using lawfare, using the judiciary to sort out political problems. So these days, when you have a centrist government who's under pressure and they're worried about the fact that a conservative or a right-wing party might do well in the polls, they basically find some legal solutions to curb their activities, to limit their influence. So this is very clearly a highly politicized decision. And it seems to me, when you look at the judgment and the justification for applying that immediate ban, it's very clearly done on political grounds. And they even make points like, unless we do this, there's going to be demonstrations by left-wing activists. So it's very clearly not a legal judgment made by an independent judiciary, but it's by essentially political activists who are determined to teach Le Pen and the RN a lesson. I think that's very important to realize. I think what's very significant here is that we now have a situation in Western Europe where democratic decision-making and party politics and representative democracy are all being systematically subordinated to the role of the judiciary. So the legal system has become, in de facto, the main authority within society. They're the ones that seem to wield more power than Parliament does. And that's a whole reversal of the way that things should operate in a democratic world. But yet, there's been very little discussion about the foundational issues that are raised by this particular affair, because it really affects everything to do with the way that a democratic society operates. So this isn't just simply a one-off vindictive action against a formidable political leader. This represents a major shift in the way that society is governed and run, first of all in France, but also by implications in many other parts of the European Union.
Yeah, and Paul, one of the things that's caught a lot of people's attention is the sense that there's, and has fueled the suspicion that there's kind of political motives at play, is the idea that there's something of a double standard involved. The misuse of parliamentary funds, as kind of lamentable as it might be, is actually a relatively common, almost everyday phenomena in the European Parliament, and even particularly some French figures who seem to have escaped quite the same punishment as Le Pen.
Yeah, exactly. We have a very interesting case with François Bayrou, and so the current prime minister with his party Modem. So previously had a similar case, and in fact, so in February 2025, he has been found guilty. Not him, sorry. His party has been found guilty, but not him, which is very interesting. And so that's true that the costs were different. It was only it's already big, but 200,000 euros and not several billions. Not billions, sorry, millions of euros. We are not yet at billions. thank God. But still, he hasn't been found guilty, and it's very useful that he's not guilty, even if he was the party leader of Modem. Now we see this kind of double standards, and one of the arguments you talked about. So precisely, they say that it will cause irreparable damage to the public democratic order if they don't use this ineligibility right now. And also a second argument that they use is that they claim this ineligibility before going to the Court of Appeal. So right now, to prevent recidivism, which can't be the case because Marine Le Pen is not an MEP anymore. So this is very interesting.
And Frank, it's a sign of, how unexpected this is at one level, that actually a large number of figures across the French political spectrum, including Jean-Louis Mélenchon, the leader of the very left-wing party in France, has come out and said that these are matters that should be handled through the political process and not through the courts.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that there are still people who have some notion of what democracy looks like, and who also understand that if you can do this to one political leader, then the day after tomorrow somebody else can get targeted the same kind of a way. And I think it's actually quite good that a number of members of the left, but also of the centrist political parties, have raised their reservation and criticism that this is not the way you deal with a democratically kind of informed society. You don't basically prevent a leading candidate from running in this kind of a way. I think that kind of reaction is very positive. But what does concern me is that at the same time, these kind of reservations, and we had the same thing in Romania, where the leading candidate was banned from running for president. These reservations seem to have an entirely rhetorical character. They're not really calls to action. They don't really have any consequences at the moment. And it seems to me that unless the RN is able to mobilize its base, mobilize its supporters, unless democratically minded citizens in France are going to get involved and demand that this ban should be lifted, we're going to have a problem here in France for a long time to come. And I know that there's going to be a demonstration in Paris. I think it's not this Sunday, but the Sunday after. Or is it this Sunday? And I just hope that they're able to have an important demonstration, a show of force that can be built upon later on.
Yeah, and Paul, how has this, as far as you feel it, gone down in France itself? I know that some people have been already claiming that the French public seems to support the conviction, which might be true, but they might not support the punishment. What do you think the feeling is in France about this kind of level of a sanction being levied at a major politician?
That's very interesting. We have indeed this, I would say, these double standards ourselves, which is that we can make the difference between, I would say, the political part in someone and his or her mistakes, talking about a human. But sometimes everything is linked. We have a previous case about 2017 with someone who was running also for to become president from LR. So we had previous case before during a presidential campaign where a candidate has been prevented to go further during the presidential campaign because he has been found guilty. It was for another case. So we have this in mind, and we feel that it's happening again. So we have these big protests, and we also see in the polls that, in fact, what's happening is that the opposite about what we could think is that Rassemblement National is currently raising in polls among the French people, which is also once again very interesting.
So, Frank, I mean, if it's the case, I mean, Le Pen is currently appealing. It looks like they might hear the appeal ahead of the next presidential election, I hear today. But if it's the case that Le Pen is banned from running altogether and the court upholds that decision, then most people say the kind of torch for the party will fall to Jordan Bardella, that obviously kind of slightly untested politician, but seems relatively popular. What do you make of that scenario where Le Pen's actually banned from running and it's down to Bardella?
Well, I think it's a big unknown. It depends upon the momentum that the RN is able to maintain in very difficult circumstances. I think that as matters stand, Bardella can do really well in an election. People often say he's a little bit too young to become president. But when you look at Macron, and his particular role, I think that Bardella could easily match that. And I think the really interesting thing for me is that he has 2 years to mature. And he's matured quite a lot over the last few years. And I think that if he's able to evolve and develop during these 2 years and establish an independent profile for himself, so he's not just simply seen as being Le Pen's boy, but as somebody that's a serious figure on his own right, I'm fairly sure that he would do really well in the election. Obviously, a lot depends on the other candidates. We don't yet know who's going to become the major competitor for him. And then there are other people standing in the wings. I mean, there's Maria Maréchal, for example, who I think will fancy her chances now that her aunt might not be running. So it will become a very interesting process. But the thing that I really hope is not going to happen is that the right just splits, which it does has a capacity to do time and time again. But rather they kind of come and unite together, especially in light of what has happened, the flagrant injustice that was meted upon Le Pen.
Yeah, and Paul, what do you make of Bardella? I know many people talk about the fact that he could be a kind of a rising candidate without necessarily the baggage of the Le Pen family kind of around him. What do you make of his chances?
It's a double-edged topic. The thing is that on one side, Asrou is very young, and in France we have these double standards. Once again, we hate and we love kings at the same time. So we love like very strong and quite authoritative figures like the most well known, of course, is General de Gaulle, and everyone currently, I would say that most of candidates always call for General de Gaulle, and they still like try to link themselves somehow to his legacy, which is very surprising but interesting. So maybe he doesn't have this charisma and this aura yet. On the other side, as you said, it doesn't have the Le Pen name, and so it can finally end this, unfortunately, this like legacy of Le Pen, which was started by Jean-Marie Le Pen, and he still have this. Le Pen's name still has this aura about the fact that it's Le Pen, and we link it to Jean-Marie Le Pen, and for a lot of leftists, it's like the ultimate red flag to say, but Le Pen's name is linked to Jean-Marie and he did something that we consider as bad and blah, 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 blah. Also, it's not done for Marine Le Pen because she can get pardoned by President Emmanuel Macron. But in order to get pardoned, she needs to be recognized as guilty. So to do so, she needs to say no to the appel court, la cour d'appel. I will say it in French; it will be easier. Sorry, and or it needs to. We need to wait for the appel judgment, which will be, as they said, in the summer 2026.
I've seen a few people floating this idea that Macron might pardon Le Pen. Do you think it's likely?
It can be like a deal, but will she accept it? Even if if it might be proposed by Macron, will she accept it? This I don't know, because it will mean that she recognized the fact that she is guilty.
Yeah, I think it was finished, not just for that reason, but also because at that point, sort of in the election campaign, Macron can make the point that I pardon her, as if, sort of I was the good guy here. And therefore that she is beholden to me. I think that creates a wrong dynamic in an electoral campaign.
Yeah, and one element that maybe we need to talk about a bit more is just the fact that, so lots of people who are celebrating this verdict, and certainly people here in Brussels and in the European mainstream, celebrating this like they did the banning of Romania's presidential candidate, Calin Georgescu, as a kind of victory for the rule of law. And it shows, doesn't it, Frank, the way that the term rule of law no longer means adherence to constitutional codes and stuff, but just means the application of one particular set of beliefs that usually come from the Brussels mainstream.
It does. The rule of law these days means that the law rules. And the law these days is made up according to political calculations. I think we've seen that with human rights law, which is entirely political. And we see this very much in the European courts, where essentially under the guise of an independent judiciary, political decisions are made systematically, time and time again. And I think that as a result of that, what we have is a situation where the courts have become a law unto themselves. And when I think of the rule of law, that's really what it's all about, that the courts have got this capacity to rule, rather than the people who've been elected to parliament and who constitute the governments.
So moving on, today, as we're recording this on the Wednesday, it's been announced as what Trump's calling Liberation Day, which is the day that they've promised many tariffs are going to go into effect. In Europe, there's been, and among EU circles, there's been quite a debate about how to respond, whether with tariffs of their own. One interesting piece of commentary, I think, seems to be the fact that the European Central Bank and figures around the European Commission are keen not just to kind of respond to this as an economic trade war, but as a political one. And so they talk a lot about sending a strong message and taking what are explicitly political stances on this to try and kind of push back against Trump. I mean, the tariffs, we've said this before on the podcast, Frank, tariffs are obviously going to be quite painful for Europe, and was a danger that reciprocal tariffs make it even worse. But what have you made as much of the economics of it, which we could get into, but just the political reaction to this escalating trade war?
Well, I think on both sides there's been a unfortunate tendency to interweave politics into trade relations. So Trump has told the British that any kind of deal they make will be contingent on Britain doing something about the freedom of speech. Which I think is an unnecessary intervention in the domestic affairs of a different country. And Europe is doing the same thing big time by essentially trying to suggest that its reaction to what's going to happen in America is going to be highly politicized. So a lot of the European politicians are making the point that if they are going to have new trade deals and new tariffs, then they're going to try to use tariffs here in Europe in such a way that it's directed at goods which basically are produced in states that are Republican. So they're making a very clear distinction between penalizing the Republican section of American society and being hands-off with the ones that are Democratic, which again is a highly unusual but also highly interventionist kind of policy in the political life of another society. So in both cases, I think there's an immaturity that's attached to these kinds of negotiations. And I do worry about the fact that people haven't actually caught on to the fact that once you start tariffs, once you introduce a new regime, especially one that's relatively high, it's got consequences to the domestic economies that are very difficult to predict and can have especially in the short run, very destructive outcomes.
Yeah, and Paul, what industries do you think are going to be worrying most about the impact of the tariffs? Obviously, the automotive industry in Europe is obviously already under quite a lot of pressure. What do you think the impact of some of these might be, and are the European elite actually capable of responding to this?
Yeah, one of the big industry, indeed, we are suffering about currently is like the automotive one. We are under pressure in Europe against the Chinese automotive markets, which are definitely the leader about electrical vehicles. We see now recently some damages against Tesla, and we see some superchargers. They have been destroyed. One recently in France, I think yesterday or the day before. We see Tesla parking lot or Tesla dealerships being affected by this. So we are fighting Americans' electrical cars, and we are far behind talking about electrical vehicles development in Europe. And now with the new potential tariffication from USA against Europe, talking about cars, for French brands, it won't be like a big deal because we don't sell many cars in America. But for a German automotive industry, it will be a disaster. I think, if I remember the numbers well, from Mercedes, for example, they export in America 40%, I think up to 40% of their car production. So it will be very important for them. So yeah, from Chinese side about electrical vehicles, and if we can't even sell anymore our own vehicles in America, it will be difficult.
Yeah, and Frank, I mean, you touched on this, but one of the things that really seems to stand out is the lack of kind of political or financial maturity, maybe even on both sides of the debate. So on the one hand, you've had European officials complaining that Trump said, right, you got to buy more American natural gas and oil products and things like that. And so they've gone out and tried to arrange trade deals, and then they can't even find the right person to talk to because the Trump administration is kind of so chaotic. And then at the same time, the European officials are complaining about tariffs, but saying that then taking increasingly heavy action on American tech companies, which everybody knows is one of the key focuses of American trade policy, and has been one of the things they've clearly set out. So is there this kind of lack of maturity on both sides?
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think Europe has been using protectionist measures for some time, but the way they do it is by doing it under the guise of regulations, helping to secure the safety online. Mm-hmm. Or somehow managing, sort of the different digital companies in the interest of, protecting children, all the rest of it. So there's all kinds of little tricks that are used that are harnessed towards protectionist measures. And I think America has been doing the same thing. So there's, in one sense, this is nothing new. But what is new is, when tariffs are almost discussed as an end in themselves. And I think that in America, there seems to be this idea that tariffs are going to benefit the American economy because, more and more investments will stay in the United States rather than people purchasing goods from abroad. But at the same time, we know that often if tariffs become an end in themselves, they do encourage almost like a slothful approach towards investment. It doesn't really help labor productivity from being raised. It basically means you're kind of artificially creating a market just simply because your goods are cheaper than the ones coming in, even though you've produced them at far greater cost than your competitors. And what I see happening is, because you have to remember that a lot of the focus has been on Europe. It's been a kind of an intra-Western sort of economic conflict. I think the main beneficiary of all this will be Asia, because despite the fact that people have been saying that China is the problem, and people have said that both in Europe and America, somehow China is not really in the center of the frame. And they basically are seeing what opportunities there are in terms of playing off the different players, kind of almost like cherry picking, seeing, where they can move in. And certainly in the medium term, I think China is going to be the main beneficiary of an economic war between Europe and America, if that war actually does escalate. I mean, at the moment, it's a lot of talk and no action, but that can change by the time we finish this TV show.
Yeah, and one of the criticisms that's been leveled of the Trump administration is that there's a tendency to take the line of least resistance. And so rather, they talk a good game about China, but rather than actually addressing that issue, it's very easy to push the Europeans around, who are obviously in quite a weak state. But Paul, I wanted to ask you about at some level, this is also a failure of leadership in Europe. We've got the head of the ECB. We talk about corruption scandals. Christine Lagarde, her own very famous corruption scandal, yet she's allowed to be the head of the ECB. And also a whole coterie of politicians that don't seem particularly well versed in trade policy. Do you think our leaders are up to these difficult negotiations?
I think, we can see what happened with the Ukrainian war, but the fact that we have been pushed away from the table so easily, and now, quite surprisingly, and now it looks like Marine Le Pen is doing this peace treatment by herself. That we had similar reaction from both Trump and Putin's administration, who are definitely advocating for her. So we are not on the table of negotiation about Ukrainian war anymore. So I don't see how we would be able to be strong on trade negotiations.
One of the more amusing articles and kind of scandals in European politics has been the suggestion that the European Commission, which is notoriously secretive and notoriously slow at answering official questions, was actually maybe, and the European Parliament President Roberta Metsola is currently investigating this, but there's a suggestion that they, instead of answering the questions that were put to them as they have a kind of a legal duty to answer these questions, instead employees were using ChatGPT to churn out the answers to some of these questions. We know, Paul, that there can be an accusation that people in the European institutions are a little bit too lazy to do the proper work, but what did you make of this kind of micro scandal?
Well, everyone's lazy at some point, so I won't blame them for using ChatGPT. But first of all, there are 30,000 staff to work in this field, so I'm quite surprised that they are so busy that they need to make their life easier using ChatGPT. Also, I would say that the biggest problem I have with this is like the fact that ChatGPT, it hasn't been produced by any European Union member. It's actually American. So they say, no, don't worry. We use something called GPT at EC, which is a Wolof version of ChatGPT. Okay, but still that's American. Even if it's a Wolof version, I wouldn't trust American company to be absolutely fair about something that important about European Union affairs. Most of all, also they explain that they only use this GPT at EC to summarize documents, to correct the attribution of questions among services, which is fine if we want to be nice, but also they use it to create some software code, which is, in my opinion, something very tricky to deal with. And also we have some companies in Europe trying to develop their own ChatGPT, and we have, for example, we advocate for my country. Sorry for this.
I knew you were going to bring up the chat at some point.
Of course, I'm obliged. I'm French. So we have this generative model called Mistral in France. What I read about is that it's not as good as ChatGPT yet. We hope that there will be better with time. But they are not as good as ChatGPT about images and pictures analysis, and also about video. Do we need these to summarize documents or to correct attribution of questions among services? I don't think so.
Yeah, and Frank, I mean, there's an amusing story here where everyone will be familiar with people shirking their responsibilities and trying to do less work. But it's actually kind of cuts to the heart of an issue that we've been coming into quite a lot, especially in our work exposing the NGO propaganda complex, which is that there's a kind of institutional aversion in European institutions from answering truthfully the questions that are put to them. And this is true whether it's the Commission or the Parliament or the rest of it.
Yes, I think it's almost like a symbolic ritual in the European Union that you don't answer questions properly, that you try to find a way of sidestepping the challenge of giving a clear, forthright answer. And there seems to be this impulse to make sure that information about the going on within the European Union never see the light of day, or only are communicated in the most incomprehensible form. One of the things that we have found looking at the European Union is just how difficult it is to find out what's really going on. It's almost as if the information that they provide exists at several layers. And as you kind of looking into the different layers, you find it very difficult to see where particular bits of information emanate from. And particularly, you find it very difficult to see the connection between different documents and different outputs that the European Union provides. And it seems to me that this is not an accident, but almost like a commitment to being the opposite of transparent, to being, to obfuscating the way that these things work, which tells you quite a lot about the integrity of this organization. It tells you a lot about the ethos and the work culture of this organization, which is why I'm not surprised that people are so casual about using AI in this kind of way, because as far as they're concerned, they're very indifferent as to the quality of information that they provide to the public.
Yeah, well, people can check out on our YouTube channel both Frank and my speeches in the European Parliament, where we were explaining the work that we've been doing, exposing the NGO propaganda complex, and also go and check out the 2 reports that we've released on this topic on our website, which we can link in the description. But for now, if you've enjoyed the MCC Brussels podcast, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Make sure you give us a like wherever you're watching this, or leave a comment about things you'd like us to discuss in the future. But that's all for this week. So thank you very much to Frank.
Pleasure.
And thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you.